Welcome to the podcast, Restore Yourself, Restore Your Marriage, where it's all about discovering the thoughts that get you in the mood, the thoughts that get you out of the mood, and how creating a deeper connection with yourself creates a deeper connection with your spouse. I'm your coach, Shelly Anderson, coaching you through life, love, and intimacy. This is episode number 166, Blue Balls and Blue Pearls. Oh no, what are we talking about today? Blue balls? What? Okay, I'm sure most of us have heard of blue balls, right? This is usually a phrase that is used when there is some sexual frustration on the part of the husband. Now, if we think of the word blue, when it comes to our feelings and our emotions, this color is often used in reference to some type of sadness, right? So if a husband is conveying that there is a sadness taking place with his testicles, we can take a closer look at that, right? Unfortunately, sometimes when we hear this term blue balls, or when it is used, we need to pay a little bit of attention to the way that it is being used. Because if we use it as a starting point to have a conversation, to gain understanding, to provide some clarity, and to have a mature conversation, that is one thing, and that is a very positive thing. But we also have to use some caution and be aware if we're using that term, or if that term is being used and there's like a hidden agenda behind it, right? Or if there's some type of guilt trip that is coming along with it, or manipulation, or to remind the wife of their duty to be a good wife and perform her sexual duties, to relieve the sadness that comes with the frustrated testicles, right? And so we have to just remind ourselves that these are a form of controlling tactics. And so that requires a slightly deeper look at what is taking place, right? We have to look at our own sense of uncomfortableness, right? There's two sides of this uncomfortableness. We have the husband's side, who feels uncomfortable with what is taking place in the testicles, and this is his attempt to relieve that uncomfortableness. But then we also have the wife's side, where if she hears these terms, she has an understanding that her husband is uncomfortable, and that in turn makes her uncomfortable. And so she's also going to want to respond to that, to also lower not only his uncomfortableness, but also her own, in knowing that he is uncomfortable. So she may enter into having sex with her husband with a different motivation, right? With the motivation to do things out of duty or to relieve his uncomfortableness, but not her own, as far as a sexual uncomfortableness. And so the end result is that we may end up with the husband being somewhat relieved in the testicle area, and yet maybe the wife not being relieved as far as, what's happening in her genital area, because maybe she's entering into that sexual experience with the motivation of that is not actually going to please her. It's not going to tap into the pleasure part of her brain. And so the whole experience is going to become frustrating. So usually blue balls is used when a man and a husband is sexually frustrated. We usually don't hear women use this term. In fact, she often doesn't use a lot of vocabulary and terms when it comes to her own sexual frustration. And so, but what if we did use a term? What if we used blue pearls, right? Pearl is often used out in the world as a representative of the clitoris, right? We can see this in jewelry, we can see this in art. A pearl is often used as a symbol for the clitoris. So what if we were like, hey, as a wife, we also experience the blue pearl. And that is probably going to look very different as far as the experience goes from what her husband experiences. But it doesn't mean it is any less significant or important or valuable, and also requires that we take a closer look at it. Now, it's important to know and to recognize that blue balls is not a medical condition, right? This isn't going to send you to the hospital. Men are not going to die from blue balls. And so it's important to know this determining factor because there is a condition, and I've talked about it before, that is a medical condition, and you're going to need to get to the hospital right away, and that's testicular torsion. So we need to make sure that we're not swapping these two as a form of manipulation. Testicular torsion is when the actual testicle inside the scrotum twists. And so that vein that supplies blood gets twisted up. So the blood supply actually gets cut off. And this does become a medical emergency. And usually the growing area, the scrotum, the testicles, like they will swell. They will actually turn blue and they will become painful. And usually that man is going to need to get to the hospital within 6 hours so that he can go into surgery, have that testicle untwisted by the surgeon, and hopefully restore that blood supply. That can keep the testicle alive if that's able to happen within 6 hours. A lot of times, if it goes past that, the testicle dies and has to be removed. Okay, so that is a medical emergency. Not having sex for 2 days does not cause that. It does not cause the testicle to twist and to die. So we need to make sure that we're not pretending that our sexual frustration because we haven't had sex in a few days is the same thing. Now, when we think about the concept of a blue pearl, being sad because it has its own sense of frustration, this is going to look a little bit different. The clitoris does not get twisted up. It doesn't lose the blood supply the same way a testicle could. We don't have that same type of situation that could send us to the emergency room with a similar medical problem. But if we think about it in terms of the sadness of the clitoris, now that is something that could be addressed. And this will come in the form of a female's frustration sexually, but not necessarily because it's been a day or two, right? This usually her sexual frustration usually comes for different reasons. And a lot of times this is going to come because stress is high. And she may be stressed for a lot of different reasons. It could be things that are going on with her kids, with work, things happening at school. Maybe there are things that are happening in the marriage, whether it's regarding sex or not, that could be adding to her stress. And we have to remember that stress is one of the biggest blockers to female desire for intimacy, but also to ignite the arousal system, to get it activated. And if it's not activated, then sex is not enjoyable. The other thing that we may not recognize is that when stress levels increase and we have a high level of cortisol, which is the stress hormone running through our bodies, this can also lower the already low amount of testosterone that is circulating in the woman. So obviously our testosterone levels are not at the same degree as a man's, and they're not supposed to be. They already are at a low level for women. But if you add stress to that, it makes it even lower. So if we already struggle with a desire to be intimate, high levels of stress are going to make that even greater. And so we need to take a closer look at this. And here's the other thing too that we may not be aware of is that when stress is high and our testosterone levels go down even lower than what they normally are, there's something that happens to our body, to the female body. There's a few things. The vaginal area will become more dry. And this is not a fun thing to experience, especially if you want to have sex, because dry sex is often painful. Lubrication is an important aspect. And so when stress gets high, our lubrication system is going to suffer. And so this natural process that women have of being able to lubricate the inside of the vagina to make sex enjoyable, that is going to be affected and not in a positive way. And so it will increase the level of discomfort of sex. And so we have to really take a look at this, especially when it comes to the big picture of things, because if we're not having an enjoyable experience while we're having sex, we're not going to want to come back for more. This means all of our motivation and desire for more intimacy is going to continue to be low. This is a big challenge for women because we usually already struggle with a desire to be intimate. And so if we're having sexual experiences that are not enjoyable, that's not helping us with our desire. So her sexual frustration looks different than her husband's sexual frustration. His is more based on frequency and hers is not. Hers is more based on what is happening in her mind. It's her mental health and it's her emotional health. Those are huge contributors to her sexual frustration. And so we need to look at that. We're going to have to take a look at the stress levels and make sure that we are keeping the stress level in check. So stress for a woman, where does that usually take place, right? If we have a lot of things on our plate and we're feeling overwhelmed and super stressed, it's not like that happens in our elbow or in our knee. That is going to take place in our mind. It can show up in our body as a symptom, but where stress happens first is in our mind. We have to pay attention to what our mind is doing. So when stress levels are high, yes, that is a huge blocker. It's going to interfere and overpower the testosterone levels that are taking place in our body. This is something that's not talked about a lot, right? This is a lot of the misinformation that's out there or the information that is just not easily known. It's what I like to say is part of the clitoris conspiracy out there. We're not having enough of this important information out there for women to know about themselves and also for their husbands to know about their wife. So there's a lot of things that could be contributing to the wife's high level of stress. It could be that there's just a lot of busyness. There's a lot of things happening in life. It could be that intimacy is not the experience that she is hoping that it can be, that she longs for it to be. It's not what she thought it would be, and she feels like something is missing. So these things could be adding to her stress levels going up, which will in turn affect her testosterone and therefore make some of the physical symptoms also show up. Now, if there is a high level of stress taking place in her mind, this is going to create mental frustration. And from a life coaching perspective, if you are having a lot of negative thoughts going on in your mind and thoughts that are frustrating, that is going to create how you feel. So that is going to create emotional frustration. So now we have two levels of frustration taking place, the mental and the emotional. Now, a desire for intimacy falls into that category of our emotions, our feelings. And so if we are feeling emotionally frustrated, it is going to be very difficult and challenging to just all of a sudden be like, oh, yeah, I should have sex now. I'm in the mood, right? In fact, we're going to feel a level of frustration in our desire for intimacy. We may even wish, like, oh, I wish I could just turn that on. But because we have all of this other mental stress and negative emotions taking place, we are going to struggle and feel the struggle of not being able to flip that switch on. We're going to have to do it first mentally with our thoughts. But if we continue on with this pattern and we don't switch our thoughts, then our frustration with our desire to be intimate will then have a ripple effect on our level of being able to be aroused. So now we will experience arousal frustration. And we have to remember that the purpose of arousal is to prepare the body for a sexual experience. It's supposed to prepare the body so that the sexual experience is a positive one from a physical point of view, right? So this changes our breathing when we go into arousal. It actually can affect the state of mind so that we let go of some of the busyness of our brain when we actually go into the arousal phase. So if we find that our brain is still super busy and going through our to-do list, we have not moved into the phase of sexual arousal, which means we're not preparing our body. Our body can't lubricate. The vagina can't lubricate in a way that's sufficient to make intercourse enjoyable. So all of these things are very interconnected. Now, if our body is feeling frustrated with the arousal process, then intercourse is also going to feel frustrating and uncomfortable and unpleasant, which will also make orgasm frustrating to achieve. And if we are having sex and not feeling pleasure from it, not enjoying intercourse, it becomes uncomfortable, and then not achieving orgasm, then the part of our brain that gets rewarded by pleasure is never activated. So then we end up thinking at the end, at the conclusion of that whole experience, like, what was the point of that? I didn't enjoy it. There wasn't any pleasure in it. Why would I want to go back for more of that? And so that creates, again, a level of frustration for women. It's the blue pearl, right? The clitoris gets frustrated. Maybe it got stimulated for like a minute, but because the other things were not in place, it couldn't enjoy it. It viewed the stimulation as an added level of stress instead of something to be enjoyed. Now, these are all the things that take place that add to sexual frustration. And so if a wife is feeling all this frustration that's taking place mentally, emotionally, and with her body, of course, that is also going to in turn affect how her husband is experiencing that sexual encounter, right? He may be able to have an orgasm, but is like, oh, I know she didn't enjoy that. And so it can also add to his frustration because he also is wishing that it was a better experience for his wife. And so Again, both husband and wife are feeling frustrated, but for their own reasons. Now, this last week, I had a couple approach me for the first time. And I think a lot of times that this is exactly how the experience goes. They kind of just start asking a few little questions here and there because they're probably experiencing some frustrations themselves and are a little bit hesitant maybe to just straight out ask if I can help. So they will present some scenarios with me or to me and to kind of see my response. And I just wanted to bring this up because a lot of times we think our own experience is the worst, right? Because we're frustrated. And this couple came to me and casually said that they are having sex about once a year. And they're both very frustrated, but they're very frustrated for very different reasons. And I haven't started working with them yet. And I really hope that I will be able to, because there's a lot of hope and a lot of progress that could be made with just a few simple things that they could do. And so when they're looking at their problem, let's say they came to me and we're able to start working together, how they view the solution to sexual frustration is going to be very different for each of them. And so it's going to be important that as we think about sexual fulfillment, that it's not a one answer solution. And that solution is not just in frequency only, without addressing some of the underlying things that contribute to female frustration. So what's needed is a solution that is more complete and more all-inclusive and not just one-sided. So going along with that is this concept of wholeness. Part of the way fulfillment is measured out in the world is this idea that there is a completeness, that there's a wholeness. And so if we only view sexual fulfillment in regards to frequency, that's an incomplete measure. So we really need to take a closer look and say we need a way to measure it that's actually complete and whole. And also there is a part of the definition of fulfillment has to do with the order. Being able to fulfill an order. And this is going to be crucial for female pleasure, that there is an order of things on her sexual journey. And usually things need to be done in the proper order. Otherwise, she's frustrated and her husband is frustrated. So this is not a problem with either spouse, right? This is not a problem with the husband. And this is not a problem with the wife. We have to keep people out of our mind as being the problem. People are not the problem. The problem is the problem. And the way we think about other things is the problem. And if we're thinking negative things about our spouse, and if we're thinking that they are the problem, that actually is the real problem. So this really requires us to look inward and self-reflect on the thoughts that we are having. We are usually missing a complete system, and it's usually the female system that we don't know about. And so parts of that are missing. We're not using the intimacy track because we don't know what it is. So the parts of the intimacy track are also not in place. And usually the prerequisites for the female arousal system have not been activated, right? Because the female arousal system does have prerequisites, but the male arousal system does not. And so we have to take into account those prerequisites of the woman and put them into the entire equation. We also have to consider that when it comes to the female prerequisites, that they are not all based on what the husband is or isn't doing, right? We may think that those are the prerequisites, but they are not. And so if we don't know what other prerequisites are outside of our husband doing our to-do list, we really need to take a closer look and find out what those are. That is the whole purpose of the course that I offer, the emotional intimacy effect, intimacy beyond sex. That is the whole point of that course, is to make sure we know what those components are outside of our husband. We need to know those things. Yes, maybe one or two contributors can be our husband, but those are not the only contributors by any means. So we need to look beyond our spouse to be able to ignite female arousal. So we also are going to need to choose thoughts on purpose throughout our day, especially for the women and the husbands. Actually, each spouse needs to do this. We need to choose thoughts on purpose where we're not blaming our spouse. We're not saying they are the problem. So throughout our day, I want you to just pick a time, have it be a random time, right? Like 1:30, and put a little reminder in your phone, set an alarm. And when that timer goes off, I want you to choose to think a really good thought about your spouse, something you appreciate about them, something that you love about them, a quirk about them that really attracted you to them when you guys were dating, the things that made you fall in love with your spouse. I want you to think about those things. Not that that replaces all the other things that are maybe frustrating you, but usually it's because we're thinking negative things and placing the sole responsibility on our spouse. That's the biggest problem we face. So we need to start putting some more of the good back into our day on purpose with intentionality, and just do it at 1:30 or pick another time. And set your alarm for every day this week and choose to think a positive, amazing thought about your spouse. Sometimes you may need to also include a better thought about yourself or about sex in general, and not have such negative thoughts about sex. This will probably be ring more true for the women than the men. Once you start to think better about yourself, about your spouse, and about sex, you will feel better about those things. And when you feel better about those things, that's when real arousal can be ignited, and the desire to be intimate can actually be felt and experienced. And of course, when those things are activated, then the sexual experience itself is going to be more enjoyable and more pleasurable. And then we'll be able to lower the levels of frustration that are being experienced. So this next week, let's see if we can increase our awareness of the actual components of the intimacy trek and put them into place, have them go in order. And then let's choose to think thoughts that benefit us and serve us, either about ourselves, our spouse, or about sex. Okay? Because the more you restore this type of intimacy with yourself, the more you can restore it with your spouse. Thank you so much for listening today, and I hope you will join me again next week.